It was a time of conflict in the community of faith, where some were insiders and others were outsiders. It was a time of division in community leadership, where political and religious authorities were mistrusted and discredited. It was a time when most common people were without power, a time when cultures clashed. And yet, it was a prosperous place, a Greek-speaking urban area with a large Jewish population. It is in this time and from this place that Matthew paints a portrait of the life and ministry of Jesus. Here we see Jesus facing division, ministering in the margins, demonstrating servant leadership, challenging allegiances, and widening the divine embrace more than many dared imagine. Here, in the pages of Matthew, we encounter the Messiah. Yet Jesus was not loud or demonstrative. His life and teaching simply drew people to follow him. He made history by starting in a humble place, in a spirit of love and acceptance, and allowing each person space to respond. His vision of life continues to challenge humanity. His influence continues to sweep over history. His teachings still lead us toward dignity, compassion, forgiveness, and hope, and challenge us to live the good news in our current culture and time. Encountering Jesus changes us. How will you encounter Jesus today?
Good morning. I love seeing your faces and having you answer me back, so thank you for that. If you are fairly new to Christian Fellowship or I haven't had the chance to meet you yet, I'm Pastor Beth, or just Beth is great. And you have come this morning as we are in the middle of a series called Encounter. And so what we've been talking about the last few weeks are encounters that Jesus has with different people and different groups of people in the book of Matthew. And so our focus has been on Matthew the last few weeks. And so this morning, actually, if I'm telling the truth, when we were planning out the series and kind of looking at the calendar and how the dates filled, I looked at Pastor Michael and I said, actually, I think you need to call Lester and make sure you can go to Urban Empowerment on November 6th, because that's the message I'd like to do. And so sure enough, it happened to work out that way. So I am actually really happy to be here today because we're going to be talking about what it looks like to widen the divine embrace. So we are going to look at that this morning. We're going to be centering on two passages. But before we get there, I want to tell you a story about a pastor that challenged me. And this was the middle of my college career. I had come to Columbia to go to Mizzou. And I had come in contact with this pastor. And he asked me a question I hadn't really thought of before. He said, should there be churches for the unchurched? Should there be churches for the unchurched? Now, what he was saying in that question was, should there be places and should there be spaces? And most importantly, should there be people who are thinking about and care enough about those outside the faith that they are willing to invite them in and have conversations and answer their questions and help them discover what a relationship with Jesus Christ would look like? And that is a question I had never encountered before. You see, I come from a pretty small town, and I had grown up there, and everyone around there kind of looked and acted like me. I grew up in a Christian home. Most of my friends were Christian. My community was Christian. And like I said, most everybody around me either went to church, knew of church, and that was that. And that was all that I had been exposed to. And honestly, I was pretty content. I really didn't know any better. And so I was really content. Now, when he asked me this question, though, I was in a very different scenario because I had come to Columbia and I had gotten a job, part-time job, at the McDonald's on campus. So how many of you remember the McDonald's at Lowry Mall? Yeah, okay. I was there for a while. And as he asked me this question, I started thinking about the faces and the people that I had come in contact with at McDonald's. They kind of started scrolling through my mind. And there were probably 80 to 100 of them. It was a large team. They came from not just all over the state, but all over the country, from different nations, spoke different languages, definitely had different faiths, different religious beliefs, and some of them didn't know who God was at all. And so it was a very different perspective. And so as I thought about them, I realized that for the first time, when I had kind of started there at work, I realized for the first time that I was really the outsider. Because I was told time and time again, "Oh, Beth, you're the only one who has any interest in going to church around here." Or there might be a couple more, but out of 100, it was pretty slim. And so I was surrounded by people very different than me, and found myself oftentimes feeling like an outsider in that, especially as it related to my faith. So the next few years and decades would prove to be really interesting, because this question didn't leave me about should there be a church for the unchurched. And so it had challenged me. What does it look like to widen the divine embrace, for me to embrace people that are very different than me? And so I learned how to have encounters. And in this particular situation, I don't really like the word encounters, because it's more like normal conversations. I had to learn how to have normal conversations with people who were very different than me. I found myself buying them Bibles, studying with them, looking back at the Gospels, the Gospel of John, and trying to help them piece together, things that they had never learned about who God was and why Jesus came, and those kinds of things. And so in that time of learning and being in that environment with my McDonald's friends, I came across different passages, and several of them are very like the two passages that we are going to look at today. And so we're going to be taking a look at the story of the centurion, which happens in Matthew chapter 8, and the story of the Canaanite woman that happens in Matthew chapter 15. And so we're going to look at these two passages where Jesus encounters Gentiles, okay? Gentiles. We're going to talk about what that means and who they were. And those are outside of his identity as a Jew. So he's encountering people that are outside of his identity. Now, what's interesting is that in Matthew's time, to the people that he was writing to, there was still a lot of tension and a lot of debate about how wide God's embrace was going to be. And so this was something that they debated over and over. Would the Gentiles, and could the Gentiles be included in God's divine embrace? Could they be part of the people of God? And so we're going to jump into this hot topic like we were right there during the time of Matthew when he's writing these stories. So first of all, if we want to understand the tension that exists between the Jews and the Gentiles in these two stories, we have to ask ourselves, who are the Gentiles? And so some of you in here may be very familiar with the answer. Others of you may not be sure, or it may be really confusing. So we are going to look at it for a few minutes. So the Greek word for Gentiles simply means nations or people. Nations or people. So the term Gentile doesn't really describe who someone is. Rather, it describes who they're not. And so a Gentile was someone who was not of Jewish descent. A Gentile is one belonging to any nation or any people group other than the Jewish people group. So to make that even clearer, they were different than the Jews. They were different in culture, and they were also different in religious belief. Okay, so there's the Jewish nation, and then there's the Gentiles that includes everyone else. Now, when we talk about the Gentiles, we first hear about them. The first reference is in the Old Testament. Because from the beginning, God designated the descendants of Abraham. So Abraham's descendants were the Israelites, and they are known, and we know them as the people of God, God's chosen people. So he chose the Jewish people. They were to be a witness to other nations. Now, we also know, if you think through your history, that he made a covenant with them, and he revealed the laws to them, or the 10 Commandments. So we read that story in Exodus with God gives Moses the 10 commandments for the Jewish people, his chosen people. And they were supposed to live according to these commandments. Those outside of the nation of Israel were considered Gentiles. So that would broadly describe people who didn't believe in God because they didn't have access to, they weren't given the 10 commandments. And so then they weren't living according to them. Okay? Now, so throughout the Old and the New Testament, there's a differentiation between the Jews and the Gentiles. We encounter this over and over. And it can be a little confusing, but I'm just going to let you wade into the tension a little bit because that will help us understand these passages in Matthew. Because we go back and forth. Are the Gentiles going to be included in God's kingdom? Or are they not going to be included in God's kingdom? And how do we know? So when we read in Ephesians, Paul describes the Gentiles this way. Now, this is a broad overview, but it will give you an idea of what the Gentiles were thought of in the New Testament during the time of Paul. It says, "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do." Okay, we've got this up on the screen for you. "In the futility of their thinking, because they are darkened in their understanding, and they are separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them." So partly because they don't have access to these laws, "and the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed." How would you like to have that description? But this is how the Gentiles were seen. They were seen as those who didn't have access to God's truth, and therefore they didn't follow it. And that led to all kinds of impurity, greed, and the things that Paul is mentioning in this passage. Yet, in the Old Testament book of Genesis, God foretells of his plan to include all nations in his kingdom. So we have this about the Gentiles over here. We go all the way back to Genesis, and he says something else. And in these verses, we call these verses the Abrahamic covenant. So we're going to look at these real quick. It's Genesis 22, where God says to Abraham, "I will surely bless you. I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring," and this is the important phrase, "shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." All of the nations of the earth. So all the way back in Genesis, God is foretelling and promising that his kingdom is going to be open to all people. We also know that there are Gentiles in the lineage of Jesus. 3 of those happen to be Ruth and Rahab and Tamar. So what's going on here if we have these like mixed opinions and this tension about the Jews and the Gentiles? Well, as the story unfolds, we know that Jesus is the bridge. He's the bridge between the Gentiles and God. Jesus' message of repentance, salvation, his death, and his resurrection, they all extend not only to Jewish people, but to the Gentiles as well. We know that the disciples go on to build the early church, and they were intentional to bring the gospel message to all nations, which fulfills the promise of the Abrahamic covenant, that all will be able to worship and serve him. But in this space, right here, in the middle of the book of Matthew, we're not quite there yet. Okay? They're not quite there yet. People are not yet clear about God's love for the Gentiles. And the gospel hasn't yet gone out. It hasn't gone out to all the nations yet. So we're kind of at a middle place, a stuck place. In fact, in this place in Matthew, Jesus is even clear about what his primary mission is, and that his primary mission is to the Jewish people. So we read about this in Matthew chapter 10, where he is sending out his disciples. Okay, this is what we know from Matthew 10. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So those would be the Jews, the lost sheep. And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. So in these other stories, most of them that we've been talking about during this series on Matthew, we see the disciples doing this. And we see Jesus doing this, cleansing lepers, raising the dead, casting out demons. But yet here as he sends them, he says, go to the Jewish people. It's not time yet to go to the Gentiles. But yet, we also see that Jesus does have these two encounters with Gentiles in his ministry. Now, the encounter with the centurion in Matthew chapter 8 comes before he clarifies his mission, right here. And the story of the Canaanite woman comes after. So let's dig into these two encounters where Jesus meets these Gentiles. We're going to put the scripture up there and leave it up there as we talk about it. So this first one, Matthew 8, 5 through 13, the faith of the centurion. When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him. Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, and he's suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and the soldier goes. I say to one, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and he said to those who followed him, truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and the west, and they will recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is again referring back to the Abrahamic covenant. In the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom, meaning some of the people of Israel, may be thrown into outer darkness in a place that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion, Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. Now let's talk about a few points of interest, things that are helpful to us in these verses. First of all, the centurion we know was a total outsider. He was an outsider in three different ways. First of all, he was a foreigner. He was an enforcer of the imperial Roman rule. So he was under Rome. And he was a Gentile. He was also a man of authority, and he comes to Jesus with a request. Now, in the English Standard Version, which is what we've read, Jesus answered his request with a statement. And the statement was, I will come and heal him. Sounds pretty straightforward. But in the Greek sentence structure, Jesus' response reads more like a question, more like a rhetorical question. And it's like Jesus is saying, Am I to go and heal him? Is that what you want me to do? Do you want me to go? And as we will see in just a few minutes, as we look at the other story of the Canaanite woman, there's some interesting parallels. Because this is a question, even a hesitation, as Jesus in his humanity here is trying to figure out what he's going to do. Okay? Because he thinks about his mission. We know he's clear about his mission, but this centurion has come up and engaged him. And he is now involved in this encounter. But he knows that if he meets the centurion's request, that he's going to be breaking the Jewish law in two ways. It means he would have to go into his home, the home of a Gentile, and he would also have to touch a Gentile in order to make him well. So we catch him in this spot where he's kind of thinking, what am I supposed to do here? What is most important? But the centurion responds by appealing to Jesus' authority. He says, I know you can do this because I know who you are. And I know you have the authority. And so his statement is a statement of both humility and of great faith. that would not have been expected from a Gentile. And so as we look at this passage and we look at the one to come, we see a pattern. A Gentile makes a humble request. Jesus seems to hesitate just a little bit. The Gentile evidences great faith, and Jesus, kind of in awe or in wonderment of the faith and the fact that they have more faith than a lot of the Jewish people, he responds by meeting the need and answering the request. And in this case, that meant he healed his servant. So for the first time in the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus' encounters supporting his mission to the Gentiles, and we see his messianic authority extend beyond the boundaries of Israel. And this is important to us because we also see that birthright is no longer a guarantee and that outsiders are going to be allowed in. Now, as we flip over, let's look at Matthew chapter 15, and let's set the story of the Canaanite woman right beside this one and look at some things they have in common about what Jesus does and what he says and how he responds in this interaction. So let's read this together. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from the region came out, crying and saying to him, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he didn't answer her a word. And his disciples even came up and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." And Jesus answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So he's re-clarifying his primary mission here. But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "Is it not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs?" And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. So in these verses, this story, we find Jesus after an altercation that he has had with a group of Pharisees. And so he withdraws from them and he finds himself in this district, the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now, this was Gentile territory, and it was known for being extremely wicked. So people would have known that this was a wicked territory. Now, commentators disagree on one point in this story. They disagree when it says that he withdrew to this district. The big question is here, does it mean that he went toward the district, or did he actually go into the district? Because if he actually went into the district, it would mean he was violating his own kind of command to the disciples when he sent them out, because he would have been crossing into Gentile territory. Or was he simply getting close enough for this woman to be able to encounter him? Was he near the border? Now, what's interesting here is whichever one it was either Jesus or the Canaanite woman that crossed the border, that crossed the boundary in order for this encounter to happen. Now, in Jesus' time, Gentiles from this particular area were known as Syrophoenicians. Now, that's a big word. You don't need to remember that word. It's not magic or anything. But why it's important is because while Matthew is writing, that's normally what he would have called her. That's how he would have described her in this passage. But instead, he calls her the Canaanite woman. And so what does that mean? There's got to be a meaning behind it for him to use the word Canaanite, because it was a word that had not been used for centuries. It was an obsolete word. So it would be like if I was introducing you to Pastor Steve, instead of saying Pastor Steve is from the UK, I would say something like, Pastor Steve is an Anglo-Saxon. And you would all look at me like, what does that mean? Okay, so it was an obsolete word. They wouldn't have expected to find it here, but he uses it because it has theological overtones. So it means something. And so Bishop Andy Taylor, he kind of just describes this very succinctly. It helps us understand why this matters. So we're going to read a quote from him. It says, the Canaanites were those who lived in the promised land. So this would be back in the Old Testament. They lived in the promised land prior to the arrival of the Israelites, before they show up. They worshiped idols, and thus they were a threat to God's people. The Canaanites were considered the enemies of God's people, so therefore they were the enemies of God. So to call this woman a Canaanite is to make her a total outsider, unworthy of God's grace. So this is to help us understand just how uncommon this encounter would have been and how much of an outsider she would have been. Now, given these already hostile relations that we know about the Canaanites and the Jews, it was also very audacious for this Canaanite woman to approach Jesus at all. Okay, because her gender, as well as her ethnicity as a Canaanite, are both a hindrance. Okay, so Sharon Renge, she is a theologian and professor, helps us this way. She says, in first century Palestine society, women were supposed to be invisible. No Jewish man, especially one with a religious task or vocation like Jesus had, would expected to be approached by a woman unless she was a prostitute. So this changes a little bit of how we see, or how we can see, this story of Jesus encountering this woman from Canaan and what it was like for her to reach out to him, because she calls out and she says, Jesus, Lord, Son of David. So even in her greeting to him, we know that she understands that Jesus is the Messiah. And she also cries out or shouts, demanding her seat at the table to share in God's blessing, which was challenging the whole ideology of that day. It's pretty audacious. Now it says Jesus didn't say anything at first. And then it says the disciples actually wanted to send her away. But she asks again. And Jesus does something very interesting when she does. He makes a statement, again, that is much more like a rhetorical question, as it was with the centurion. And then he listens for her answer, which is a statement of great faith. So he says to her, is it not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs? Now that sounds at first glance like a really derogatory statement to make. But what he's actually saying is, Canaanite woman, do you think it is okay to take something that belongs to the Jews and give it to the Gentiles? Do you think that's okay? And she responds by saying, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. It's like she's saying, yes, Lord, it's okay. Because the Gentiles too, remember, they deserve a seat at God's table. So her boldness and her persistence and her remarkable faith, even though she is a woman, a Gentile, and a despised Canaanite, empower her to cross the boundaries that would have otherwise kind of kept her captive. And she empowers Jesus to do the same. She reminds him in this encounter of his larger purpose. His purpose is to cross the line into Gentile territory, his purpose to share the gospel to those that were seen as unworthy and didn't have access to it. She reminds him that God's kingdom is for people of all nations. So we have a really cool thread that is weaving here through the book of Matthew. And it starts in chapter 2. It continues through the end. We see the full tapestry of God's plan to all the nations revealed. Anna Case Winters says it this way for us. The story of the Canaanite woman continues and extends the theme that was begun with the homage of the wise men from the east in chapter 2 and will culminate in the final chapter, chapter 28, where the mission bursts its boundaries and extends into all the world. So we first encounter the Gentiles in Matthew 2, the wise men. They come from afar to worship at his feet. He encounters the Gentile, the centurion, and again the Canaanite woman. And then in Matthew 28, in the Great Commission, which Michael's going to talk about in a couple weeks, he lays it all out there and says, go everywhere, extend this gospel everywhere. So what can we learn from these encounters, and what does it have to do with our encounters today? What is Jesus wanting to say to us today? I love this quote from David Swanson. It's so articulate, better than I could have ever said it. So I want us to read it and think about it. It says, it is important for us to remember that there are many expressions of the image of God in his church. One must not see itself as the orienting center for anyone else. There is not one. One is not seen as normal, while others are seen as different. As Gentiles, we are all welcomed outsiders. We have been grafted in, welcomed by the blood of Jesus, who get to find ways to decenter ourselves and celebrate others for the sake of our neighbor. We are all welcomed outsiders grafted in. So let's look real quick at these two stories. What does Jesus model for us about widening the divine embrace? First of all, in both of these stories, Jesus was present where they were present. He was available walking around the towns where the centurion could come up. He got close enough at least to the Canaanite woman where she could approach him. He was present in the places the Gentiles were present. Secondly, we know he recognized the need. In this case, both of them were asking for healing for someone that they deeply cared about. In our day and age, who knows what the need is? It could be anything. But he recognized the need. Then he asked questions with humility. He asked questions about their faith and their understanding. And when they initiated an encounter with him, he responded. He responded with those questions. And he listened to their answers with a heart that was intent on learning. And this is the part I think that stood out to me the most, is that Jesus is actually moved. This is not a one-sided encounter where he's only doing something for the centurion or the Canaanite woman, but Jesus is moved by their faith. It helped him be reminded of why he's there. And the last one, he gave more than he took. So these encounters were mutually beneficial. They were learning and gaining from each other in their encounter. He met their need, and their faith strengthened his faith. So just like Jesus reminds us in these passages, we too can widen the divine embrace with those that we come in contact with. Now for me, like I mentioned at the beginning of the message, back in the day, that was my coworkers at McDonald's. Today, it's various different groups of people. For you, it might be the lady that cuts your hair, the waiter or waitress at your favorite restaurant. It could be a neighbor, a coworker, a parent of one of your kids' friends at school. It could be your favorite checker at the grocery line. But there are people that God is asking us to widen the divine embrace. And so I just want you to pause for a minute and think about this question. Who is on your heart for God that might think that they're beyond the divine embrace? Who has God put on your heart? Or maybe, if nobody's coming to mind, let's ask it this way. Who has he put in your path? So maybe you didn't even ask for him. Maybe you're wanting them to go away, or you just wish they weren't there, or they're kind of invisible, but God has placed somebody in your path. And he is giving you the invitation to widen his divine embrace. So as you have hopefully somebody in mind that you're thinking about, I want to ask us, each of us, these questions again more personally. Are you present where they're present? Are you in places where they are and accessible to them? Is there a need that you can meet? Maybe they've articulated that need. Maybe they have no idea what it is, but God's inviting you to relate to them, to get to know them, to find out what need you can meet. Third one, are you asking questions with humility? Are you willing to reach beyond these people that may think, believe, look different than you, this person, and get to know them with questions? Maybe finding out about their spiritual background or their lack of spiritual background, or why they might be angry at God. And are you listening with a heart that's intent on learning, of really trying to know and understand what is going on with them? And are you giving more than you're taking? You know, if we stretch, if we widen, like Jesus did here, these are going to be mutually beneficial relationships for all of us, because they will always give back. As we give, they will also give back. I love this quote by Robert Romero. He says, if we are to change the world, this is we as Christians, if we are to change the world, we must do an about face, a change of direction, and believe that the good news that Jesus is Lord and King. That as the Jewish Messiah, he is also the Savior of the world. Jesus came to make us and the whole world new. Nothing and no one is left out.